In Module 5, we will describe the teacher's role in implementing interventions. Module 5 includes 5 submodules, from Module 5A to Module 5E. In Module 5A, we discuss the teacher's role in identifying evidence-based interventions that can be used to support students' academic, behavioral, and social needs. Research has shown that there is a strong link between students' academics, behavior, and social skills. Educators cannot fully engage students in a variety of learning experiences when students' problem behavior and the absence of their social skills are unaddressed. Therefore, teachers must address students' skills in these areas using evidence-based practices. Teachers are responsible for implementing evidence-based practices. It is critical for teachers to understand what an evidence-based practice is. In short, an evidence-based practice is a practice whose effectiveness is supported by rigorous research studies. Rigorous research studies can include experimental, quasi-experimental, or single-case studies that meet high experimental standards. The benefits of evidence-based practices are many. The primary benefit of implementing evidence-based practices is that it is more likely to pay off in terms of improving student outcomes than using practices that are not evidence-based. Teachers are going to have less wasted time and fewer wasted resources because evidence-based practices give you the best bet that they are more likely to work. The flow chart describes the steps of implementing evidence-based practices. The steps are described in more details in the remaining submodules. Listed here are websites from which you could locate evidence-based practices to support the behavioral, social, and academic needs of students. Teachers can think about an area of academic needs or a behavior concern of students in their class. Then browse the websites provided on the previous page to identify an evidence-based practice to address the needs of the students.
The topic of Module 5B is implementing interventions within a multi-tiered system of support, what teachers can do. We will refer to multi-tiered systems of support as MTSS. MTSS is a comprehensive system of support that is implemented school-wide. MTSS includes standards-aligned, culturally responsive, and high-quality core instruction for all students, along with universal screening to identify those students with greater support needs. In addition, database decision-making is used to determine both support needs and responsiveness to intervention. Finally, MTSS includes supports and services in a tiered fashion depending on student need. Tiered support offers a continuum of practices that are evidence-based. Because support is provided on a continuum, it can be matched to student needs to assure that all students are progressing both academically and behaviorally. There are numerous advantages of tiered support. The primary advantage is that the intensity of support is matched to student need. This reduces resources as most students are responsive to less intensive levels of support and fewer students need Tier 3 intensive support. Now we discuss what responsibilities teachers have in a tiered system of support. First, teachers need to make sure the interventions in place at each tier are evidence-based. There should be a team in place in each school to assist with this. Administrators also are good resources. Finally, websites that evaluate research evidence can be consulted, such as the What Works Clearinghouse that is maintained by the Department of Education, or teachers can directly review the literature themselves. Second, teachers should know the criteria for referring a student to tiers 2 and 3. These should be well defined by the school, and data should be used to make these decisions. Third, teachers should fully understand the interventions they implement and seek support and training if the implementation purpose or the implementation steps are not clear. Fourth, teachers need to implement interventions with integrity. This means that key components that make the intervention effective are implemented as designed and tested through rigorous research. If data indicate integrity is low, or a teacher is not implementing the intervention as it was designed, they should seek coaching. For more information on Pennsylvania's multi-tiered systems of support, teachers should go to PTAN Multi-Tiered System of Support webpage.
In Module 5C, we will describe what teachers can do in terms of developing action plans. After teachers identified an applicable evidence-based practice, the teachers will develop action plans to implement the evidence-based practice. The first step of the action plan development is to examine student data to pinpoint students' academic, behavioral, and socio-emotional needs. In examine student data, teachers will determine the severity level of the problem. In here, we categorize the severity of problem into 3 levels: mild, moderate, and severe. Mild concerns can be addressed as part of Tier 1 prevention, school-wide intervention program. Moderate concerns should be addressed in Tier 2, small group-based intervention. When students have severe or most intensive needs, Tier 3 intensive intervention or individualized intervention should be provided. With the applicable evidence-based practices that the teachers identified, they will select the evidence-based intervention to be implemented based on the severity of the problem. This table shows an example of how a teacher used student data to determine the severity of the problem and select the appropriate evidence-based practices accordingly. Teachers can think about how students' academic progress and behavior needs are monitored under the MTSS framework. Think about the types of data that are collected that can be used for action plan development.
In Module 5D, we discuss how to monitor action plans, what teachers should do. In this module, we discuss the process of monitoring plan implementation. This includes identifying essential components of the practice, implementing the practice with Fidelity, and then monitoring student progress and fidelity of practice implementation. Now we discuss assessing treatment integrity. Treatment integrity is a measure of the degree to which an intervention or treatment is implemented as planned, intended, or originally designed. This is important because if intervention is not implemented as it was designed, it isn't possible to assess intervention effectiveness. In other words, if a student isn't making progress, we don't know whether it's because we haven't selected an effective intervention or whether the intervention would, in fact, have been effective, but it wasn't implemented correctly. It's important to create a treatment integrity checklist as an objective way of measuring whether an intervention is being implemented as it was designed. To create a checklist, the first step is to identify the main components of the intervention. This usually involves listing the steps of the intervention and deciding which ones are critical for behavior change. For example, check-in, check-out intervention, it would be important that the student checks in with a monitor at the start of the school day and receives a daily behavior rating form. These components would need to be included on the checklist. However, although you may want the student to wait in line before checking in, it probably isn't essential to the intervention effectiveness, so it wouldn't be included on the checklist. Next, you want to assess whether the student receives an adequate dosage of the intervention. For example, if a social skills group is held 3 days a week and a student only attends 1 day a week, this needs to be documented. This might mean that the student isn't getting an adequate dosage of the intervention. To document, we record how much of the intervention a student receives. This might be how many sessions the student attends and for how long. Last, it's important to evaluate quality aspects of the intervention. For example, if a student has been disrespectful to a teacher and the teacher fails to provide feedback in a genuine manner, the student may not be receiving the intervention in the intended manner. This is an example of a checklist for check-in, check-out. You can see that the 9 essential components of the intervention are listed, and the treatment integrity monitor checks whether each component was present, not present, or not applicable. In addition, the monitor can score the quality of each component. This slide shows what might be considered for quality ratings. It's best to operationalize quality as much as possible. As this checklist shows, 0 means that the component was not implemented at all. Then ratings of 1, 2, or 3 correspond to the degree to which the intervention was implemented accurately. So you can see for step number 1, student check-in, a 1 is scored if the coordinator meets with a student in the morning, a 2 means that the coordinator met with the student during the first 20 minutes of instructional time, and a 3 is high-quality implementation, in which the coordinator met with a student before the start of instructional time. This checklist can be customized to address how it is implemented in a particular school by a particular teacher or to address individual student variations. When conducting treatment fidelity checklists, it's ideal for an independent observer to collect fidelity data, and it's best to do it periodically because of drift, which means an interventionist implements an intervention accurately at the start, but there is drift away from the required steps over time. So periodic integrity checks will assure an intervention is implemented as intended for as long as the intervention is in place. Teachers also can self-evaluate their integrity if another observer is not available. However, teachers need to try to be honest when self-evaluating, as self-reports of intervention implementation have not always proven to be accurate. Another example of a treatment integrity and checklist can be found at this link. You'll see that the checklist contains adherence to the instructional procedures, dosage of the intervention, as well as quality of instructional delivery.
After making sure that the evidence-based practice is selected based on the student's needs and that the evidence-based practice is implemented with integrity, teachers should monitor the effectiveness of the plan based on student data. Monitoring the effectiveness of the plan using student data is important because teachers need to determine whether students respond to the intervention or whether a different or additional intervention is needed. If students respond to the intervention well, teachers can also use student data to determine whether the intervention can be faded. Teachers can determine the effectiveness of the behavior intervention by monitoring student behavior using direct observation or using behavior rating scales. Commonly collected data such as office disciplinary referrals, absences, and tardies can also be used. Teachers can determine the effectiveness of the behavior intervention by monitoring student behavior using direct observation or using behavior rating scales. Commonly collected data such as office disciplinary referrals, absences, and tardies can also be used. Commercially available apps can be used to facilitate direct observation coding. This is an example of a rating scale on students' academic engagement. In academic, the effectiveness of the intervention can be determined by collecting students' academic progress data. Curriculum-based measurement data are commonly used. Individual students' progress data should be used to evaluate plan effectiveness. When examining individual students' progress data, teachers should focus on the trend of the data and the rate with which the student's performance improves and moves toward the pre-established criteria. Here is an example shows that the student's academic engagement is improved after the intervention is provided. In here, you see that during the baseline phase, the student has a low level of engagement. After the intervention is provided, students' level of engagement improved quickly and the high level of engagement maintained. The data graph suggests that the plan is effective. This graph is an example of a student who responded to the intervention as shown by the curriculum-based measurement data. Although some data points, such as week 1 and week 4 data points, are below the trend line, the majority of the data points are above the trend line. As can be seen on the graph, the student's progress follows the trend line. Most importantly, the student reaches the benchmark by the end of week 7, which was set as the final week of intervention in this hypothetical case. This graph is an example of a non-responder as shown by the curriculum-based measurement data. Although one data point is above the trend line, the remaining data points are below the trend line. As can be seen on the graph, the student's progress does not follow the trend line and remains flat. The student does not reach the benchmark by the final week of the intervention. Teachers can watch this video provided by P2G. Use the student presented in this video to describe the student's progress.
Module 5E discusses adapting interventions for non-responders, what teachers can do. What is intervention adaptation? An intervention adaptation involves making modifications to standard interventions so that they become more effective. Why is it important to adapt interventions? Adapting interventions is an alternative to moving to a more intensive intervention tier. It also increases the likelihood that an intervention will address an individual student need. This graphic shows the concept of intervention adaptation. Rather than thinking of moving across tiers, we now think of intervention adaptation as a continuum within tiers. Some examples of adaptation are to increase the frequency or intensity of an intervention, such as an additional check-in during the day or an additional 10 minutes of group academic practice each day. Another example is to adjust the requirements to receive a reward. For example, if a student is not improving, you might decrease the time interval for earning a reward in a token economy system or in check-in, check-out. Another example is to add a component to the intervention. This might look something like adding a mini social skills lesson to check-in, check-out. The procedure for adapting Tier 2 intervention is to first select the Tier 2 intervention that you will be implementing with a student. You then monitor student responsiveness to the intervention. The school should have established decision rules to determine when a student is responsive and when a student is not responsive. Then you will identify students who are non-responders to the Tier 2 intervention and finally make adaptations to that intervention. This is what the process looks like. You monitor student progress, determine if they are responsive or non-responsive, continue with assessments to determine what type of adaptation would most likely be effective, implement that adaptation, and then continue to monitor the student's progress to again determine whether the student is responsive or not responsive to the adaptation. This section of the diagram shows the steps of adaptation or intensifying the intervention. An example applied to academic interventions is a diagnostic assessment that might include error analysis or evaluating the results of a diagnostic test. The adaptation then might be to the content of instruction, such as providing foundational knowledge and skills, or adding a strategy, such as self-monitoring, in addition to using concrete representational abstract approach. And then, after the adaptation has been implemented, the student's progress would continue to be monitored over time. Now we are going to present a case study to illustrate the process that we just described. The student we'll discuss is Carl. Carl is a second grader who is 8 years old, white, and does not receive free or reduced lunch. His problematic behaviors are being disrespectful to teachers, such as arguing, saying no, not following directions, and calling out in class. He also has difficulties with peers, pushes them, hits them, and kicks them. The intervention selected is check-in, check-out. This graph shows the percentage of points that Carl received each day when standard check-in, check-out was implemented. As you can see, Carl's data showed that he continued to have problem behavior and did not consistently meet the 80% goal earned on his daily progress report. To address Carl's non-responsiveness, the following adaptations were made to check-in, check-out. First, check-ins were increased, so instead of checking in at the end of each class periods, check-ins were increased to every 15 minutes. In addition, a mini 5-minute social skills lesson was conducted each morning to review Carl's appropriate behavior the previous day and to discuss expectations for the current day, particularly as they pertain to peer interactions. This graph shows Carl's data before and after the adaptation was made. You can see that following the adaptation, Carl's data showed improvements, and he met his 80% goal almost every day. In wrapping up, we want to mention that there are multiple factors within schools that influence how well interventions are implemented, including different people with different types of expertise and time commitments. Intervention is best accomplished through teamwork to assess who is available to support intervention implementation and how resources can be best utilized.